Some games just aren't really what they seem on the surface. That's it. That's the long and short of it. So today we're going to talk about 10 games that aren't what they look like. Fair warning, we are going to be spoiling some things, but these are pretty cool. We got 10 games, so let's get started off with number 10. We are starting off with a fairly mild example of this phenomenon, The Forgotten City, which actually started life as a mod for Skyrim, pretty much looks the part of a first-person open-world RPG game. Of course, being made by what is essentially a one-man team, the scope of this project is much smaller, confined to this titular city. There's a little bit of everything here. There's combat, there's exploration, there's quests. It seems like a pretty straightforward, if short, RPG. That's only the beginning though. The big twist is that this is actually a time loop game. In order to actually solve the city's problems and get a good ending, you have to go through multiple loops and slowly unravel these mysteries in the city in order to figure out how to perform the perfect loop in order to just set everything straight and essentially win.
They're turning us to gold.
The many shall suffer for the sins of the one.
Where are you?
What makes this a mild example of this sort of thing is that it doesn't take long for the game to reveal that it's a time loop thing. You know, you can get through a single loop in less than an hour, and the surprise premise really only comes into play if you go into this one completely blind, because the whole time travel gimmick is actually, it's right there on the Steam page if you're looking. When this project was just a mod, the time travel stuff was a lot more of a surprise, just because, well, I mean, it's a Skyrim mod. That's an ambitious bit of scripting to try and pull on the creation engine, and in just a game that you really wouldn't expect to see it.
The many shall suffer for the sins of the one.
Now, next over at number 9, this one is more like it. This is the kind of thing you'd probably expect to see on this list. At this point, the big genre shift is all anybody talks about with Doki Doki Literature Club, a game that strings players along for a surprisingly long time before the big twist that just sends the rest of the game into a completely different direction. If there's one thing you have to respect about this game, it's just the commitment to the bit. I love it, dude. This isn't the only game out there to like pull such a severe genre shift, but few games really hold their cards so close to the chest for so long. There are hours of interminable generic visual garbage stuff to wade through before you get to the real meat of the experience. And to the game's credit, there's very little foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Most games of this type of transition to horror just after a few minutes or so. But this game goes on hours before the sudden shift in tone, and is really all the more effective because of that, and why it's such a memorable thing. Next over at number 8, Brutal Legend. Now, this is an interesting one because if it was up to the game's developer, Double Fine, then there would be no surprise. They wanted to tell everyone what the game Brutal Legend actually was all about. And to their credit, in some early previews, they did, but the publisher, EA, wanted to market the game like it was an action-adventure game. So when the final product came out, it was just a little surprising to find out that this rock and roll action-adventure game was actually kind of a real-time strategy game.
Go get him!
Yeah, if you didn't know, the Jack Black game that looks like a heavy metal album cover at all times isn't like a God of War style action hack and slash game or an open world beat 'em up or anything logical like that. It's actually a strategy game where you summon and command units on a battlefield. It's basically a modern version of Sacrifice. The whole thing is pretty insane in retrospect. I mean, they brought in all these celebrity voice actors and rock and roll legends like Lemmy, Ozzy Osbourne. They put together a massive soundtrack that had to probably cost a fortune in licensing, all to make this extremely niche experimental RTS. Like, yes, it's weird, but like as gaming nerds here, we definitely respect it. EA knew that all the strategy stuff would probably scare off more casual players and they wanted to make $1 bajillion out of this thing. So they put out a demo that was just the action adventure stuff. The first hour or two of the game doesn't really have any of the RTS stuff either. So you'll spend a good chunk of the game thinking that it's just a quirky action game, only to suddenly find that the real meat of the game are these strategic battles. On one hand, like I said, we respect the game for its really unique gameplay and vision. They made what they wanted to make. But honestly, can't help but wish that the whole game was just those first few hours, because that stuff was really fun. Next, over at number 7, another obvious choice for a list like this, Nier Automata. It doesn't actually change all that much. It's an action game with some shoot 'em up sections, and that technically never really changes. The thing that changes the most is the tone of the game. It starts off as what you'd expect. A pretty straightforward, awesome action game where you're fighting mindless robot enemies in a pretty straightforward plot about driving back the enemy and restoring humanity. Slowly, as the game goes along, the whole premise starts to really erode. You find out that aliens that created the enemy machine life forms have been long dead, so there are no overarching bad guys anymore. Much later, you find out that humanity is long dead also, so the entire war with the machines is just utterly pointless. It's this proxy war, kind of, where like the only side left standing are the proxies, long past the point where there's any goal or purpose to this endless fighting. It becomes clear that in many ways, the machine life forms that you're fighting are actually, in some ways, more sympathetic than the androids you're fighting as. All these revelations culminate in the game's biggest twist, where an entire second act is revealed after beating the game, not just once, but twice. The existential horror really starts to creep in at that point, and doesn't really let up until the game's grim and I'd say like extremely meta and ultimately uplifting finale. Now, look, if that sounds contradictory, well, it is. But it's cool, trust us. Look, of course, if you've played the original Nier first, then you probably see this twist in tone coming. That game pulled the same sort of trick and in a few ways actually was even more experimental. The original makes you think it's some kind of Zelda-like action game only to throw you into side-scrolling segments, Diablo-style top-down sequences, adventure game puzzle sections, and one memorable sequence that's actually like a text adventure. Look, Nier games, they're both extremely weird and they contain a lot of surprises. Even when you think you're prepared for whatever insane twist the game will throw at you next, they always find some way to top themselves. At this point, even though we spoiled it, Nier Automata is something you absolutely should play. I remember making the before you buy video on this game back in the day, and it was so hard to talk about the game without spoiling some of this stuff, but you know, now that the gates are open, either way, you should still really play it.
What happened to my clothes? Years of multiplying, years of fighting and wars. Their sense of self just deteriorated.
Next, over at number 6, a game called There Is No Game. It's a hugely expanded sequel to an old Flash game, and it impresses because it manages to subvert itself multiple times over. Right from the start, it's throwing you for a loop by trapping you on the title screen. So the gimmick here is that you can play around with the title to make things happen. The game is the title screen, right? You can go into the options and mess with things further. So the joke here is that the entire game is all the UI and menu elements that are usually the stuff between the actual gameplay in a normal game.
You just never give up, do you?
Now, once you get into a comfortable flow, that's when There Is No Game really pulls the rug out from under you by introducing entirely new games within the game. There's a like LucasArts style old school adventure, Legend of Zelda, a puzzle game, and that's not even the end of it. What's so amazing about this game is how far it's willing to push the bit. Like, there's just so much more to it than it initially seems, and every time they add another wrinkle, it feels like there can't possibly be any more. But there is, and the way the game constantly subverts your expectations is actually really fun. For once, a super meta, genre-defining indie game isn't pure just horror nightmare fuel, which is refreshing, if nothing else.
Stop following us?
We are all going to die.
Shoot the glitch! With what? A debugging gun?
We are all going to die.
Next over at number 5, Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons. This is kind of a cute one because when you look at the thing, which is Joseph Fares' first game, you know, the guy behind It Takes Two, A Way Out, you automatically just assume it's a co-op game. That's what it looks like from all appearances. And, you know, Joseph Fares is these days known as the co-op guy. Those are the games he makes. They're 100% co-op games. They have to be played with 2 players. That's just how they work. So if you come into this game from his later work on games like I mentioned before, like A Way Out, It Takes Two, you're in for a rude awakening because while all appearances point to it being a 2-player game, Brothers is actually completely single player. One player directly controls both brothers on screen with each thumbstick dedicated to controlling a single brother, which I'll be honest, it takes some time to get used to. Hopefully your brain is good enough for this one. This is where a lot of the challenge comes in, where you're directly controlling both of these characters simultaneously. It can sometimes feel like the game wants you literally to like pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time, but that seems to be by design. It's supposed to be a little difficult to wrap your head around. Look, it's not a long game, but there are a lot of creative ideas here, and it really manages to pull at your heartstrings, especially at the end. This is a game that is more deceptive in hindsight than it was at the time, but if you went in blind then, I can definitely see someone being thrown off by the 1-player co-op concept. Either way, it's cool. And to be honest, we never really have talked about this game in many videos, so we wanted to bring it up. Now at number 4, Everhood. This oddball rhythm game RPG seems like the sort of thing you'd expect from something that so clearly is borrowing cues from Undertale, but it still manages to surprise by not just subverting your expectations about RPG narratives and stuff, it also subverts your expectations for an Undertale-like game. The story starts off with the expected level of quirky cheerfulness with the occasional dips into weird darkness, but then things shift sharply into pitch black darkness in this surprise second act where your true objective reveals itself. So like Undertale, this game has multiple endings and the choice to possibly kill or spare many of the characters, only this game really twists the knife by having you meet and befriend all these people, and then in the second act, you have to decide to kill them or not. So there's a lot more of an attachment there built in. What really subverts this game from, you know, what you'd expect from Undertale is that, spoiler alert, I mean, this whole thing is spoilers essentially, but here is that to get to the good ending, you have to kill everyone. Instead of being nice and saving everyone, to get the best ending, you must kill them all. There's a reason for that, so it makes sense in the context of this game, but still, the whole thing gets extremely dark in the second half. Way more than you'd expect from a game that looks like this. Now at number 3, The Messenger. This action side-scroller game looks like an NES Ninja Gaiden for the first few hours before shifting into a Metroidvania for the rest of the game. Look, it's a creative little bait and switch. The start of the game looks like an 8-bit platformer with the music and everything to match, but once you complete the final stage and get to the quote-unquote ending, then everything changes. Suddenly, the graphics are 16-bit, the music then has that distinct Sega Genesis twang to it, and your objectives become non-linear and way more complex. This is another one of those games where the twist isn't exactly a secret before release. You know, they definitely advertise the game as doing the 8-bit and 16-bit generation shift, but look, if you just saw this on Steam or something, you know, you're just going into it completely blind without knowing all the promotional material, then you've got to imagine the gameplay shift in the second half is a big surprise, just like a mind-blowing thing, especially if you love retro games. It would be like if you were playing some modern old-school side-scroller like those Bloodstained tie-in games, which are NES Castlevania style games, only halfway through they suddenly look like Symphony of the Night. Actually, that would be awesome. Somebody should probably get on that, man. Now down at number 2, Inscription. This remarkable indie card game is a standout not just because of how much the game changes from where it starts to where it ends, but also just because of the depth of its game mechanics. Most of these sorts of indie subversions are relatively simple types of games, like visual novels or narrative puzzle games essentially, but Inscription is a lot more. They throw so many surprises at you, and the game keeps technically building and building upon itself in ways that expand the core gameplay experience, while still also managing to feel radically different. It starts off as a roguelike card game, then reveals itself to have kind of a 3D escape room element, only to completely shift into something totally new in the second act. Now, instead of a creepy cabin and roguelike progression, it's now like a kind of pixel art RPG with more complex card mechanics, and it goes from a run-based game to a deck-building RPG. And that's not even the end of it. The game drastically changes again in the third act, where things get a whole lot more meta. It is really something how Inscription managed to be so cohesive, yet also change so dramatically. The core idea of card-based mechanics stay the same, but the entire genre completely changes around the game with each distinct act throughout. It's a game everybody knows about by now, but I bet it still manages to surprise you at least once. Now, down at number 1, Frog Fractions. Yes, the original subversive game. It leads you to believe that it's a simple kind of edutainment-style children's game before going completely off the rails the further you get in. Not in like a horror way though. This is comedy, pure and simple. More absurd things happening the further away from the standard game you manage to get.
It was Felipe's son, Andre Felipe, who developed what he called the punching strategy in 1637, after seeing a schoolboy strike another in anger, causing him to fall down. When Andre Felipe challenged the then champion, British expatriate Sleepless Bill Bishop, to a match,
years later, the developers behind the game kickstarted a Frog Fractions 2, but in order to retain the surprise from the original, they kept the name and genre of the sequel a secret, so nobody even knew what the final game was called for a while. Eventually, fans figured it out. Glittermitten Grove is Frog Fractions 2, and it does everything the first game does, but more. The base game is this weird side-scrolling fairy city builder that's just elaborate enough to look like a real game. You know, you'd actually have to spend a decent amount of time playing the game before you find the actual Frog Fractions content. Just imagine people scouring the hundreds of bottom-of-the-barrel Steam games trying to find the next Frog Fraction games. It makes our brain happy. Gamers are crazy. When they're dedicated, they can do anything, and Frog Fractions and the discoveries and lore around it all is a great example of that. Those are 10 games that aren't what they look like. We got a bonus one for you though as well. Xenogears, this PS1 Square RPG, makes a massive shift into second disc, but in this case, it's not intentional design choice by the developers, but rather a desperate move to at least finish the game with the time and budget they had left. So the first disc is what you'd expect, an RPG, while disc 2 is something a little different. It's technically kind of a visual novel. The developers ran out of time and money, with only a small portion of the content meant for Disc 2 finished, so they strung together what little they did have with intermittently long expository dialogue presented as like an abstract shadow play with the occasional picture to add some kind of visual aspect to the whole thing. They did the best they could. Huge, world-changing events happen in lines of text here, and it's completely bonkers. It makes Evangelion's notoriously unfinished final episode seem perfectly normal by comparison. The entire second half of Xenogears is a complete mess, man, but at this point, it's just part of the game's eccentric charm. Back in the 90s, it was just kind of expected that your highly ambitious mecha anime would end in total disaster. That's just what happens in these things. It's terrible, but also kind of amazing at the same time. Anyway, I've been Jake, and those are 10 games that aren't what they look like. There are so many other examples we could talk about, so let us know in the comments some of your favorite moments, some of your weirdest switch-ups. We'd love to make a follow-up to this, but let's talk anything about these games down in the comments. If we helped you pass the time, if you like talking games with us, clicking the like button's all you gotta do. It really helps us out. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.